Hey class, in this lesson we're going to start looking at Henri Bergson. He is a philosopher who was famous around the turn of the century. He was much more famous in the past than he is now, and he's having a kind of resurgence of popularity right now, but was definitely eclipsed through the 1930s and 40s and 50s and has become much less known, but is becoming again a center focus in philosophical study in America today. He famously had a debate with Einstein that was televised and was a really big, important thing. And he supposedly was giving a talk and caused the first ever traffic jam in New York City. This was around the time that there were first cars in New York City. I think it was 1919 or something like that. And supposedly the lines in order for people to go hear him speak were so long, so many people came, that there was the first ever traffic jam was caused by him. So he was definitely extremely famous during his time. He was a Nobel Prize winner for literature. Anyway, he's one of my favorite philosophers, and hopefully you'll grasp a little bit of what is so great about him. Bertrand Russell, who was a philosopher of logic, criticized him a lot, but also called him a great visualizer. And I think that while Bertrand Russell is wrong about Bergson in a lot of ways, this aspect of him is very true. He gives us very vibrant ideas or images and metaphors for understanding his philosophy. And his philosophy is deeply embedded within the history of philosophy. So there are aspects of Plato and Aristotle and Descartes and Spinoza and Kant. He's borrowing things from these people, and he's going against them. He's definitely making a step forward in philosophical history away from these people and trying to take what is good from them in order to do that. One of the biggest ideas that pushes him beyond the philosophy that comes before is the idea of evolution. So he was an avid reader of Darwin and Herbert Spencer, who was famous for kind of popularizing the ideas of Darwin at the time. And he goes strongly against Darwin. Not Darwin, Spencer. He thinks that the neo-Darwinian theories had gone against Darwin, and he tries to revive an aspect of Darwin from there. And we're not going to really spend any time talking about any of that theory of evolution, but in short, Bergson's critique was that it didn't grasp how evolution could ever bring about new forms, really a creative force of evolution bringing about novelty. And he thought that that was closely related to the idea of freedom. And he thought that without the ability to conceive of evolution as creative and a reality of freedom in life, we would completely misunderstand what is essential to life. And he applies those same ideas in relation to psychology. And that's what we're going to be looking at, as well as in morality. And that will be our next second half of this module. We will look at morality. So freedom is central to Bergson's idea of philosophy. In this text, the Introduction to Metaphysics, which we're looking at for this lesson, the main idea here is how can we talk about time and duration? What is immediately given in our experience of time and duration? And why is it that language has such a difficult time grasping that reality? So he starts out by making a distinction between absolute and relative knowledge. Between these two, absolute and relative, he's going to divide metaphysics and science. So metaphysics is going to get us absolute knowledge, and science is going to give us relative knowledge. They are both, for Bergson, they're both important. He's not saying that relative knowledge and science are bad. He's saying that they're insufficient, that alone they cannot give us reality, and we still need metaphysics for that reason. So in science, we use symbols, signs, quantities, images. We externally recompose reality and use concepts. We analyze things into component parts, and those component parts are the symbols and the quantities and things like that. And then we try to recompose them in order to grasp their reality. And he gives a couple of examples to explain this. And he says about translating a text that in the original language there's a kind of internal grasp of its meaning. And when we try and translate it, what we do is we translate it into maybe like 3 or 4 different sentences, because there's no direct translation of the words. And then between those several translations that we get, we can kind of focus in on what is behind them. And his point here is that the analysis that we give is always an approximation. We're never going to get at the thing itself through this approximation, but we're only ever going to get closer and closer to it. And he gives another explanation of this in a different text. He equates it to how we learn to pronounce a language. So he says, he's a French speaker. He says, I want to learn English. How do I learn the pronunciation of English words? He says, well, I can do it in 2 ways. I can either do it in an external way, in terms of symbols and an external recomposition. So how does he do that one? Let's go for that first one. He says, I can get a manual, a book on translation or on pronunciation, and I can learn the English words by means of French pronunciations. So he'll find in those books the French letters that are equivalents or close equivalents of the English words, and then you practice those over and over again and approximate more and more by imitation the English pronunciations. And what you're doing there is you're attempting to get at the English in terms of something not English, in terms of the French. So you use the French pronunciation in order to approach the English pronunciation. And then he opposes this to fluency and immersion. So the other way of learning it is to go to England or America and to live among people who speak that way and immerse yourself in it and learn it from the inside and come to it through the internal reality of it. So he's opposing here relative knowledge, which uses something external to the thing in order to get access to it, whether that's symbols, equivalencies, or imitations, or quantities, external representations and concepts, versus the internal, the absolute reality of the thing, the unity of its inner sense. So the poet has a certain meaning, and they translate that feeling into words. And the words approximate that feeling. And we can analyze those words in order to get closer and closer to that internal feeling. But that analysis is always external, and it's always an approximation. So on the other hand, absolute knowledge, we have absolute knowledge, he thinks. We already have it. We already grasp it in some ways. So we have feelings. When we feel these things immediately, feelings are oftentimes extremely difficult to put into words. We try to say, I felt angry for this reason and that, or we try and translate those feelings. But there's the immediate feeling that is given to us absolutely with all of its complexity. And then there's the relative way in which we try and translate it into something communicable to other people. So he has these this kind of ascending order of importance. We start with feelings, immediately given. They're complex. We're inside them, and they're difficult to translate. Then we have memory. So we have all of our memories from our entire past with all of their details. Now you try and remember something. We're trying to remember the first day of school when you went to high school or something like that. The richness and complexity of the absolute way in which you grasp that, it's going to have to be reduced to something that is able to be put into words and in terms of concepts. So we translate it into something external and something communicable. We reconstruct it into elements that are equally applicable to that memory as well as to other memories. So what we do is we go from something absolute to something relative. Another really important idea for Bergson is the idea of creative emotions. An artist has a creative emotion. They have this idea for the piece of art that they're going to create. Many artists have described this in a similar way. The video by David Lynch within this module explains it really well. An artist will oftentimes grasp the idea of the piece of artwork that they want to create as a whole, all at once. They haven't yet come to every single detail. They don't know what exactly it's going to look like, but they have this creative feeling, this creative emotion that drives them to bring it into existence. And so, felt from within, this creative emotion, it can be translated into, the director has to explain to everyone their idea, the creative emotion, what it's going to entail. You're going to need to do this. You have to tell the set design people the color scheme that is going to, convey this feeling, and like all of these very complicated parts, so that you translate the absolute internal feeling that the artist has into something capable of being brought into existence. But what is absolute and what is real there is the creative emotion, which can only be approximated through analysis. And so this leads Bergson to an idea of intuition. Metaphysics consists in an effort of having an intuition, of grasping the concrete absolute reality of time and duration, of the unfolding of psychical life, of the unfolding of our inner life, of our soul. So between the absolute and the relative, we have concepts and signs and symbols and language, which are relative and fixed and approximate, and concrete inner intuition of duration, which is given immediately in our experience and which is extremely difficult to put into words. He says that this intuition is a kind of sympathy. It's a way in which we sympathize with the unity of the duration, in which we grasp it as a whole, like a creative emotion. It's an indivisible apprehension in which all of the infinite parts are grasped at once as a whole. And it's concrete. That means that it's not something that is abstract, that is put together by saying, like, these words put together with these words, all of a sudden you get something else. No, it's something that is all the parts cohere from the start. It's not built up approximately part by part. So what is metaphysics then for Bergson? He says that it's the science which claims to dispense with symbols. Now remember, symbols are an external way of expressing something. They express things in a way that is general, in terms that can apply to many things. So metaphysics must be freed from language. It must be freed from the constraints of language. It's not dealing in terms of language and symbols and concepts, but is taking a step back to something more original that pre-exists those concepts and words. One of the central ideas for Bergson here is that in our psychic life, every moment is unique. No two moments are the same. If at very least they are different because one is before the other and another is after. So every moment of this lesson, for example, is different from the other ones because each one is before and after another one. How can language ever really express that uniqueness of every moment? Language is by definition something general. Every moment of our life is something unique. So language really is insufficient for expressing our feelings, our memory, and our immediate experience of change and duration. So then the question arises, how can one ever even hope to write a book on metaphysics? If a book is something that uses words and symbols, it will necessarily fall short of what Bergson is trying to make metaphysics do. Well, that is definitely true, and Bergson admits that. But he says that there is an option. We have another option. We have a way to get around this. Each of us must place ourselves in duration. We must place ourselves in the absolute. We must feel our own duration. And closely related to this is his idea of suggestion. Art, music, they are able to do something by means of suggestion rather than expression. So a lot of people will say that music expresses certain emotions. Well, Bergson actually kind of disagrees with this. He says it doesn't express emotions. Language expresses things through symbols. Music suggests emotions to us. And it's the suggestiveness, what it does is it makes us feel them ourselves. It doesn't force the feeling upon us, but it stirs them up within us. It evokes them within us. But we're the cause of it. We feel it ourselves. and we produce the feeling. So it's a suggestion rather than an expression. And analogously, metaphysics suggests to us intuition, the immediate grasp of the absolute reality of change and duration. So we place ourselves immediately in duration, in the continuity of concrete changes. And we grasp that reality as an absolute. Language cannot do this for us. He cannot prove to us in language by a deduction the reality of this. We have to do it ourselves. We have to place ourselves in that reality. One of the really main problems that Bergson identifies with this task for metaphysics is the role of habit. Habit is continuously pulling us towards analysis and towards intellectual cutting up of reality into symbols and concepts. So our habit is to analyze, to cut up continuity and cut up duration into symbols and fixed entities. So we must actually break our habits. We must turn away from the habitual tendencies. We must disrupt these automatic tendencies. We must break with our concepts and our symbols that help us to understand reality in a practical way. So our habits of analysis and science, these are practical, they're useful, they actually express reality in a certain way, but they hide from us the concrete continuity of time. And that's what metaphysics needs to do, is to break with, it's the science that claims to dispense with symbols. And to dispense with symbols means to dispense with our habits of analysis and our tendency to try to communicate things by translation, by putting them into terms other than the reality of the thing. And one of the really important elements of this critique is Bergson's critique of the idea of presence to consciousness, or representation. So we imagine that our thoughts are images, and these images are like instantaneous totalities that grasp something as a quantity or as a symbol. And it sums up all of the parts that is contained within it. And Bergson, he's not saying that we don't do this. We do this all the time. Think about what a tree is. You're going to come up with an image in your mind. Think about what a triangle is. You're going to come with an image in your mind. But this instantaneous grasp, it's a kind of symbolic representation that makes us grasp the thing in its relationship to our, what is a tree? Well, it's going to be whatever is useful to us to identify a tree when we see one. Its shape, whatever can be grasped in an instant. Well, this moment of grasping a single presentation to consciousness, it ignores the continuity of a gradual process in which that presentation is a part. We have this process of our conscious experience, which is a continual progress of change, and we take out this one slice from that, and we isolate it, and we identify it as the representation of something beyond it. And what we do in this process, this is Bergson's main insight here, is that we're taking it in terms of something already complete. Something that can be summed up, a totality, something where all the parts are already given. There's nothing left to be considered beyond what is given. So we ignore the reality in the making, the continuous process of coming into being, something that is never fully complete. And that is what time is. Time is something that is still in the process of being completed. It's still being accomplished. It's still progressing forward. It's a process. when we look at things in terms of an image or a totality or a symbol, it has to be necessarily in terms of the past. But it's a kind of abstract sense of the past. So Bergson, in another book, goes deeply into the way in which we remember things. He has this book called Matter and Memory, and he goes deeply into the phenomenon of memory. How is it that we remember things? What is it that goes on in our process of memory? What he finds is that every moment in our memory is necessarily different. No two moments in our past are ever the same. When we treat things as symbols, we treat them as identical. So this tree and that tree are identical. What the mind does is it abstracts from the concrete reality of different moments, and it treats things as general. It says this is what is similar between multiple experiences. So rather than so there's two problems here basically. Rather than treating the past as it really is, as an infinite multiplicity of differences, every moment being different, we treat things as being general. And that is because it's practically useful to us in order to do so. And rather than treating things that are in a process of becoming and continuously changing, we treat them as already completed. So we don't understand the past properly, and we don't understand the present properly when we try and understand things in terms of presence to consciousness. And closely related to this is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This is a name given to this idea by Alfred North Whitehead. He's another philosopher, follower of Bergson's. But this idea is exactly what we're getting at here in the introduction to metaphysics. We take the symbols, the reconstruction, the representation to be the concrete thing. We think that the world is made up of what we analyze things into. So we think that a living being is molecules because we analyzed it into molecules. But molecules given on their own don't equal life, right? Life is a process. It's something unfolding. It's something which every life is slightly different from another. There's no two living things that are identical. Every single one of them is singular and different. So when we think that life can be explained adequately through concepts and through analysis, what we do is we fall prey to this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We mistake the products of our analysis for the concrete reality. And science is an expression of reality in terms that are external to the thing. We understand it through what is common, not through what is singular, through what is general, right? Not through what is unique. Science is a generalization based on our past efforts to predict the future. So science necessarily treats things as already completed and as past, not in the proper sense that Bergson wants to say, where every past thing is completely different from every other one, just as every moment of our memory is different from every other moment. We treat it in terms of the past as a generality. But the most concrete thing that we can possibly encounter is our own sense of duration, in which every moment is completely real and is completely unique. So what is duration? Bergson explains duration through a series of images, and he wants these images to converge, to give us the unity of what has many diverse aspects to it. There's a very close connection here between this and the series of images given by Plato in the Republic, describing intuition there. I'm not going to go much into that connection, but through a series of very different images, you grasp the underlying unity by entering it from many different sides. And these sides are going to seem mutually exclusive. And Bergson actually says that that's necessary. We need to have these very different things so that we don't think that any of these images alone is sufficient to express the thing. So already in the beginning of this video, we went through them. And I'm going to replay those clips here for you. But we need to grasp these many different multifaceted aspects of duration together in their unity. So he says that it's a kind of succession and a continuity. So succession is passing beyond something, leaving something behind. So you're the successor in the line of your family. You're not your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents. So you've passed on beyond them. So succession is a kind of leaving behind and moving forward. But at the same time, it's a continuity, which is a retaining and pulling along that past with you. So these are kind of mutually exclusive things. There's succession on the one hand, which is passing, and then there's continuity, which is retaining. And duration is both of those. Time is both of those. And then it's also a kind of rolling up, an unrolling. You feel your life playing out certain things. You know, you've always wanted to do certain things, and now that you're in college, you're playing out those expectations that you had. You anticipated your future when you were younger, and now you're living them out. So you're playing out that role, and you're constantly unrolling what is contained within the past and the present in order to bring about a future. Now, in opposition to that, you have a sense of rolling up. Every moment is accumulating more and more of the past. So duration is both unrolling and rolling up. Again, a kind of opposites being brought together. Then he says it's kind of like an elastic that is being stretched. And it's a kind of continuous movement out that is pulling away from something. So in time, we kind of stretch forward. And although we're connected to a point in the past, we're still moving beyond it and stretching beyond it. But again, this is insufficient, and it's also a kind of qualitative flux in which there's a continual new advance of qualitative difference. And when we imagine a stretching, we imagine something in space, a stretching out in space, a kind of mobility through space. But he wants to say that there's an aspect of it which has nothing to do with space. So he says, imagine the color wheel, all of the infinite shades of color, and a sense or a sentiment or a feeling passes through those infinite shades. It's altering continuously at every moment. It goes from red to yellow. And when you're in orange summarizes red in some way. It still retains redness, and yet it also announces the yellowness to come. It kind of anticipates the yellowness. So it's summarizing what came before it and pulling into what is coming next, and intending and expecting what is next. So these are the first kind of multiplicity of different aspects of duration that he brings together here. Then he gives us another explanation of this. This is not in our reading, but I'll try and explain it to you. He says the continuity of duration is a unity of opposites, and that's what we just saw. And he said the continuous unity of time or duration is just like a cone. A cone is a three-dimensional shape that has a circle at one end and goes to a point at the other end. Now, between these two opposites, we have a circle and a point. if we analyze just those two things, nothing is ever going to give us any insight into how they are combined, how a cone can ever come about from a circle and a point. There's no unity between a circle and a point. But when we look at the cone, we see immediately how the base continuously tends towards the point. And in the same way, our immediate sense of duration unifies two completely mutually exclusive things: the past and passage, or passing, or a continuous becoming. So for Bergson, the past is like this base of the cone. It's being. It's something completely settled. Your past is what it is and can never change. You can change the way you think about it. You can change the way you relate to it. But the fact that you were born, the fact that certain things happened through your childhood, those things are completely settled. And what Bergson calls impassable, means they can never pass again. They can never be open in the process of occurring. They are completely decided. So the past is like the circle, completely decided. And the point is like the passing, something continuously evolving and changing and progressing. A point and a circle are completely different from each other, and they cannot be defined in terms of each other, and nothing, when we take the two of them separately, will ever show us how to combine them. So likewise, a completely past thing, which has no process to it, which has no continuity, no development to it, no change, versus something that is continuously changing. How are we ever going to recompose these things intellectually? How can we use symbols and put these things together? Circle plus dot does not equal cone. Neither does past plus passing equal duration. What we need to do, instead of trying to put these things together, is install ourselves immediately, place ourselves immediately within the continuity of that reality. So there's this continuous, indivisible unity of a cone. It's a concrete reality in which these two opposite things are unified absolutely. Likewise, when through intuition we grasp the unity of our duration, we will find a concrete unity in which the past and passing are completely unified. So, closely related to this idea is Bergson's conception of qualitative multiplicity. This is a very jargony word, and I'm going to get more into this in the next lesson. But qualitative multiplicity is expressed here in terms of the color wheel. And if we look over here, we see all of these shades and hues. There's an infinite number of them. You can go anywhere on here and find a new shade and hue. And if you move through those, like in this video that I have, you have a continuous shifting of that multiplicity. And duration is like that. Duration is something in which there's a continuous qualitative change. At every moment, there's an infinity of different qualities. Now, as we progress through that, they interpenetrate. All of the moments are united to each other. And this is best exemplified in listening to music. Each of the notes suggests to us the rest of the piece. You hear dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun, and each dun 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 encapsulates the feeling of all the other parts, and each one kind of retains the ones that came before it and anticipates more to come. So dun dun dun, you hear dun even if I don't say it. So dun dun dun, you anticipate it. And that's what happens in duration. That's what happens in our immediate experience of time. There's an interpenetration of the moments. The continuous process is reaching ahead before it gets there. It's grasping ahead of itself, anticipating what is to come next at every moment. So there's this richness of quality, and there's this continuous progress forward. It's always incomplete, always moving ahead, always grasping next and next and next. And each moment interpenetrates, so it brings the ones that came before it and it reaches ahead to those to come. And it's irreversible. At every moment, something is being added, and it's being added irreversibly from one step to the next. It goes forward in one direction continuously. So we must enter directly into this continuity of change, of movements, change of place, change of by moving our own body, the way in which an emotion evolves over time, the way in which our attention is directed temporally by a tendency towards something, or in the way that thoughts progress through different ideas, and there's a kind of continuous movement to that process. So Bergson wants to say that concrete reality, which is given to us in experience, can never be satisfactorily translated into symbols. Sure, we can use approximations, and everything I've just said to you is a complete approximation. There's nothing absolute about what I just said. The only way for you to have absolute knowledge of any of that is for you to place yourself in the experience of change and in the experience of duration and find that concrete continuity. I can artificially try and reconstruct the continuity of these ideas for you, but that will never achieve absolute knowledge of what can only be grasped by placing yourself in that reality. So this is what he calls intuition. It is scientific knowledge is relative, is symbolic knowledge through pre-existing concepts, which go from the fixed to the moving, but not so intuitive knowledge, which establishes itself in the moving reality and adopts the life of things themselves. This intuition obtains the absolute. So you cannot communicate it other than through suggestion. So me and Bergson can try and suggest these things to you, but only by placing yourself, establishing yourself in the moving reality and adopting the life of things can you obtain this absolute. And the notes of the melody, this is a very evocative way of conceiving of it, but again, this description is not the reality. This description is a substitution. It is an attempt to provide you with something that explains it, but you can only do it by placing yourself in it. So he says that like the indivisible and indestructible continuity of a melody, where the past enters into the present, which remains undivided and even indivisible in spite of what is being added at every instant, or rather, duration remains indivisible thanks to what is continuously added at every moment. So this continuous progress where something is continuously being added and is indivisible by sheer fact of being continuously adding to itself, I can never construct that for you. You have to experience that internally for yourself. Science can never explain that for you other than approximately. You have to place yourself in the absolute reality. So, in opposition to this conception of absolute reality, continuity, the mind prefers to conceive of things in terms of concepts and representations. And this is extremely practical, and it serves a purpose in science, and it serves a purpose in practical life. Bergson is completely fine with that. He's not saying that we shouldn't have science. He's not saying that we shouldn't represent things. He's not saying that we shouldn't try to have symbols and communicate and try and explain what we feel internally to each other. But he's not okay with thinking that it's more real. He's not okay with the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that we think that the reconstruction, the conceptual representation, is the real thing. It's not the real thing. So this whole tendency to cut things up and understand things in terms of symbols, Bergson explains this through what he calls the cinematographic mechanism. And all that is just the way that a projector works. So he famously comes to this idea in his book called Creative Evolution, which came out in 1907. And at the time, film was very new, and there were only these kinds of like black and white cinema cameras and cinema projectors. But what they do is they take snapshots, photographs that have no movement whatsoever. They're completely fixed. And what they do is they artificially imitate movement by rapidly shooting one after another, right? So it looks like there's movement, as like the horse galloping, but really there's no movement. Really, there's only instantaneous snapshots. So where does the movement come from? It comes from the cinematographical mechanism, the mechanism of the projector. And analogously, our mind is the thing that reproduces the continuity by the continuity of the mind itself. So when we try and understand things, we slice them up into these representations or photographs, and then we place them one after another, and we ignore the fact that this mechanism, this false mechanism, is not really what is contained within the things themselves, but is something that we produce. So in the example of the color wheel, we would say that there's red and orange and yellow, and then we say, how are they actually continuous with each other? Well, we just imagine them to be continuous by moving from one to the next. We don't grasp there the infinite variety of nuances that pass from one color to the next. We think that there is that, but we can't grasp it in a concept. So what we do is we just place one color after another one. Each one is completely fixed. It's not a fluctuation. It's not a movement. It's something static. And then we reinstate movement to the static thing. So we repeat one after another of these static images, and we pretend as though that is what continuity is. And Bergson, what he's identifying here is this idea of becoming in general, a kind of fake becoming. There's nothing in each of these snapshots that is moving. So the movement is something external to those snapshots. There's nothing essential about any of in those snapshots that is moving. The movement is added externally to the thing. It has nothing to do with the peculiarity of each. And this is what's the fundamental problem of the cinematic mechanism. And when we get into our next lesson on emotions, one emotion leads to another one, and if we don't see that as being central to the very nature of those states of consciousness, then all we do is externally add change to those states. So at one moment I'm sad, and at the next moment I'm angry. Sadness and anger are going to be thought of as completely static entities, and there's nothing in sadness that leads to anger, and nothing mobile about them. So what we do is we fail to see what is concretely real about them, their continuity and their development and their progress. And we see only these kind of signs. This represents happiness and this represents sadness, and then we reinstate the movement to them falsely. So there's an abstract continuity. We can also think of this in terms of musical notation versus the actual performance of the music. You look at the paper and you see these dots. Each one is completely outside of the other ones. And if we think that the symbolic representation of the music is the music itself, then we would assume that the page with the marks on it is the actual song. But what is a musical performance? It's not the whole score. It's something that is continuously unfolding. You can't listen to music and have the entire thing completed. It's necessarily always incomplete. And when the song is complete, you're no longer listening to it. The song is over. So it's not this artificially sliced up thing that is notation, that is the symbolic representation of the thing that substitutes the actual performance. No, it's the real continuity. It's the intensity we feel when we listen to the song, where we hear in each note the continuity from one note to the next. So habit is what is responsible for the cinematographical mechanism. We habitually cut things up into images, and we reinstate movement through a false artificial mechanism by force of habit. We substitute reality for a symbol and symbolism. So then we think that emotions are things that we name, when really they're things that we only feel. And we think that music is something that is complete and that is representable through notation, when in reality it's a continuous progress that's ever evolving and unfolding.